The battlecruiser, or battlecruiser, was a type of capital ship of the first half of the 20th century. They were similar in size, cost, and armament to battleships, but they generally carried less armor in order to attain faster speeds. The first battlecruisers were designed in the United Kingdom in the first decade of the century, as a development of the armored cruiser, at the same time as the dreadnought succeeded the pre-dreadnought battleship. The goal of the design was to outrun any ship with similar armament, and chase down any ship with lesser armament. They were intended to hunt down slower, older armored cruisers and destroy them with heavy gunfire while avoiding combat with the more powerful but slower battleships. However, as more and more battlecruisers were built, they were increasingly used alongside the better protected battleships. Battlecruisers served in the navies of the UK, Germany, the Ottoman Empire, Australia, and Japan during World War I, most notably at the Battle of the Falkland Islands and in the several raids and skirmishes in the North Sea which culminated in a pitched fleet battle, the Battle of Jutland. British battlecruisers in particular suffered heavy losses at Jutland, where their light armor made them very vulnerable to large-caliber shells. By the end of the war, capital ship design had developed with battleships becoming faster and battlecruisers becoming more heavily armored, blurring the distinction between a battlecruiser and a fast battleship. The Washington Naval Treaty, which limited capital ship construction from 1922 onwards, treated battleships and battlecruisers identically, and the new generation of battlecruisers planned was scrapped under the terms of the treaty. Improvements in armor design and propulsion created the 1930s fast battleship with the speed of a battlecruiser and armor of a battleship, making the battlecruiser in the traditional sense effectively an obsolete concept. Thus from the 1930s on, only the Royal Navy continued to use battlecruiser as a classification for the World War I-era capital ships that remained in the fleet. While Japan's battlecruisers remained in service, they had been significantly reconstructed and were re-rated as full-fledged fast battleships. Battlecruisers were put into action again during World War II, and only one survived to the end. There was also renewed interest in large cruiser-killer-type warships, but few were ever begun, as construction of battleships and battlecruisers was curtailed in favor of more needed convoy escorts, aircraft carriers, and cargo ships. In the post-Cold War era, the Soviet Kirov class of large guided missile cruisers have also been termed battlecruisers. Background: the battlecruiser was developed by the Royal Navy in the first years of the 20th century as an evolution of the armored cruiser. The first armored cruisers had been built in the 1870s, as an attempt to give armor protection to ships fulfilling the typical cruiser roles of patrol, trade protection, and power projection. However, the results were rarely satisfactory, as the weight of armor required for any meaningful protection usually meant that the ship became almost as slow as a battleship. As a result, navies preferred to build protected cruisers with an armored deck protecting their engines, or simply no armor at all. In the 1890s, technology began to change this balance. New Krupp steel armor meant that it was now possible to give a cruiser side armor which would protect it against the quick-firing guns of enemy battleships and cruisers alike. In 1896–97 France and Russia, who were regarded as likely allies in the event of war, started to build large, fast armored cruisers taking advantage of this. In the event of a war between Britain and France or Russia, or both, these cruisers threatened to cause serious difficulties for the British Empire's worldwide trade. Britain, which had concluded in 1892 that it needed twice as many cruisers as any potential enemy to adequately protect its empire's sea lanes, responded to the perceived threat by laying down its own large armored cruisers. Between 1899 and 1905, it completed or laid down 7 classes of this type, a total of 35 ships. This building program, in turn, prompted the French and Russians to increase their own construction. The Imperial German Navy began to build large armored cruisers for use on their overseas stations, laying down 8 between 1897 and 1906. The cost of this cruiser arms race was significant. In the period 1889 to 1896, the Royal Navy spent £7.3 million on new large cruisers. From 1897 to 1904, it spent £26.9 million. Many armored cruisers of the new kind were just as large and expensive as the equivalent battleship. The increasing size and power of the armored cruiser led to suggestions in British naval circles that cruisers should displace battleships entirely. The battleship's main advantage was its 12-inch heavy guns, and heavier armor designed to protect from shells of similar size. However, for a few years after 1900 it seemed that those advantages were of little practical value. The torpedo now had a range of 2,000 yards, and it seemed unlikely that a battleship would engage within torpedo range. However, at ranges of more than 2,000 yards it became increasingly unlikely that the heavy guns of a battleship would score any hits, as the heavy guns relied on primitive aiming techniques. The secondary batteries of 6-inch quick-firing guns, firing more plentiful shells, were more likely to hit the enemy. As naval expert Fred T. Jane wrote in June 1902, "Is there anything outside of 2,000 yards that the big gun in its hundreds of tons of medieval castle can effect, that its weight in 6-inch guns without the castle could not effect equally well? And inside 2,000, what, in these days of gyros, is there that the torpedo cannot effect with far more certainty?" In 1904, Admiral John Jackie Fisher became First Sea Lord, the senior officer of the Royal Navy. He had for some time thought about the development of a new fast armored ship. He was very fond of the second-class battleship Renown, a faster, more lightly armored battleship. As early as 1901, there is confusion in Fisher's writing about whether he saw the battleship or the cruiser as the model for future developments. This did not stop him from commissioning designs from naval architect W. H. Gard for an armored cruiser with the heaviest possible armament for use with the fleet. The design Gard submitted was for a ship between 14,000 to 15,000 long tons, 14,000 to 15,000 t, capable of 25 knots, 46 kilometers per hour, 29 miles per hour, armed with 4 9.2-inch and 12 7.5-inch, 190 mm, guns in twin-gun turrets and protected with 6 inches of armor along her belt and 9.2-inch turrets, 4 inches, 102 mm, on her 7.5-inch turrets, 10 inches on her conning tower and up to 2.5 inches, 64 mm, on her decks. However, mainstream British naval thinking between 1902 and 1904 was clearly in favor of heavily armoured battleships, rather than the fast ships that Fisher favoured. The Battle of Tsushima proved conclusively the effectiveness of heavy guns over intermediate ones and the need for a uniform main caliber on a ship for fire control. Even before this, the Royal Navy had begun to consider a shift away from the mixed caliber armament of the 1890s pre-dreadnought to an all-big gun design, and preliminary designs circulated for battleships with all 12-inch or all 10-inch guns and armored cruisers with all 9.2-inch guns. In late 1904, not long after the Royal Navy had decided to use 12-inch guns for its next generation of battleships because of their superior performance at long range, Fisher began to argue that big gun cruisers could replace battleships altogether. The continuing improvement of the torpedo meant that submarines and destroyers would be able to destroy battleships. This in Fisher's view heralded the end of the battleship or at least compromised the validity of heavy armor protection. Nevertheless, armored cruisers would remain vital for commerce protection. Of what use is a battle fleet to a country called A, at war with a country called B, possessing no battleships, but having fast armored cruisers and clouds of fast torpedo craft? What damage would A's battleships do to B? Would B wish for a few battleships or for more armored cruisers? Would not A willingly exchange a few battleships for more fast armored cruisers? In such a case, neither side wanting battleships is presumptive evidence that they are not of much value. Fisher to Lord Selborne, First Lord of the Admiralty, October 20, 1904. Fisher's views were very controversial within the Royal Navy, and even given his position as First Sea Lord, he was not in a position to insist on his own approach. Thus he assembled a committee on designs, consisting of a mixture of civilian and naval experts, to determine the approach to both battleship and armored cruiser construction in the future. While the stated purpose of the committee was to investigate and report on future requirements of ships, Fisher and his associates had already made key decisions. The terms of reference for the committee were for a battleship capable of 21 knots, 39 km per hour, 24 miles per hour, with 12-inch guns and no intermediate calibers, capable of docking in existing dry docks, and a cruiser capable of 25.5 knots, 47.2 km per hour, 29.3 miles per hour, also with 12-inch guns and no intermediate armament, armored like Minotaur, the most recent armored cruiser, and also capable of using existing docks. First battle cruisers. Under the Selborne Plan of 1902, the Royal Navy intended to start 3 new battleships and 4 armored cruisers each year. However, in late 1904 it became clear that the 1905 to 1906 program would have to be considerably smaller, because of lower than expected tax revenue and the need to buy out 2 Chilean battleships under construction in British yards, lest they be purchased by the Russians for use against the Japanese, Britain's ally. These economies meant that the 1905 to 1906 program consisted only of 1 battleship, but 3 armored cruisers. The battleship became the revolutionary battleship Dreadnought, and the cruisers became the 3 ships of the Invincible class. Fisher later claimed, however, that he had argued during the committee for the cancellation of the remaining battleship. The construction of the new class were begun in 1906 and completed in 1908, delayed perhaps to allow their designers to learn from any problems with Dreadnought. The ships fulfilled the design requirement quite closely. On a displacement similar to Dreadnought, the Invincibles were 40 feet, 12.2 m, longer to accommodate additional boilers and more powerful turbines to propel them at 25 knots, 46 km per hour, 29 miles per hour. Moreover, the new ships could maintain this speed for days, whereas pre-Dreadnought battleships could not generally do so for more than an hour. Armed with 8 12-inch MKX guns, compared to 10 on Dreadnought, they had 6 to 7 inches, 152 to 178 millimeters, of armor protecting the hull and the gun turrets. Dreadnought's armor, by comparison, was 11 to 12 inches, 279 to 305 millimeters, at its thickest. The class had a very marked increase in speed, displacement, and firepower compared to the most recent armored cruisers, but no more armor. While the Invincibles were to fill the same role as the armored cruisers they succeeded, they were expected to do so more effectively. Specifically, their roles were heavy reconnaissance. Because of their power, the Invincibles could sweep away the screen of enemy cruisers to close with and observe an enemy battle fleet before using their superior speed to retire. Close support for the battle fleet. They could be stationed at the ends of the battle line to stop enemy cruisers harassing the battleships, and to harass the enemy's battleships if they were busy fighting battleships. Also, the Invincibles could operate as the fast wing of the battle fleet and try to outmaneuver the enemy. Pursuit. If an enemy fleet ran, then the Invincibles would use their speed to pursue, and their guns to damage or slow enemy ships. Commerce protection. The new ships would hunt down enemy cruisers and commerce raiders. Confusion about how to refer to these new battleship-size armored cruisers set in almost immediately. Even in late 1905, before work was begun on the Invincibles, a Royal Navy memorandum refers to large armored ships, meaning both battleships and large cruisers. In October 1906, the Admiralty began to classify all post-Dreadnought battleships and armored cruisers as capital ships, while Fisher used the term Dreadnought to refer either to his new battleships or the battleships and armored cruisers together. At the same time, the Invincible class themselves were referred to as cruiser battleships, Dreadnought cruisers. The term Battlecruiser was first used by Fisher in 1908. Finally, on November 24, 1911, Admiralty Weekly Order No. 351 laid down that all cruisers of the Invincible and later types are for the future to be described and classified as battle cruisers to distinguish them from the armored cruisers of earlier date. Along with questions over the new ship's nomenclature came uncertainty about their actual role due to their lack of protection. If they were primarily to act as scouts for the battle fleet and hunter-killers of enemy cruisers and commerce raiders, then the 7 inches of belt armor with which they had been equipped would be adequate. If, on the other hand, they were expected to reinforce a battle line of dreadnoughts with their own heavy guns, they were too thin-skinned to be safe from an enemy's heavy guns. The Invincibles were essentially extremely large, heavily armed, fast-armored cruisers. However, the viability of the armored cruiser was already in doubt. A cruiser that could have worked with the fleet might have been a more viable option for taking over that role. Because of the Invincibles' size and armament, naval authorities considered them capital ships almost from their inception, an assumption that might have been inevitable. Complicating matters further was that many naval authorities, including Lord Fisher, had made over-optimistic assessments from the Battle of Tsushima in 1905 about the armored cruiser's ability to survive in a battle line against enemy capital ships due to their superior speed. These assumptions had been made without taking into account the Russian Baltic Fleet's inefficiency and tactical ineptitude. By the time the term battlecruiser had been given to the Invincibles, the idea of their parity with battleships had been fixed in many people's minds. Not everyone was so convinced. Brassey's Naval Annual, for instance, stated that with vessels as large and expensive as the Invincibles, an admiral will be certain to put them in the line of battle where their comparatively light protection will be a disadvantage and their high speed of no value. Those in favor of the battlecruiser countered with 2 points. First, since all capital ships were vulnerable to new weapons such as the torpedo, armor had lost some of its validity, and second, because of its greater speed, the battlecruiser could control the range at which it engaged an enemy. Battlecruisers in the dreadnought arms race. Between the launching of the Invincibles to just after the outbreak of the First World War, the battlecruiser played a junior role in the developing dreadnought arms race, as it was never wholeheartedly adopted as the key weapon in British imperial defence, as Fisher had presumably desired. The biggest factor for this lack of acceptance was the marked change in Britain's strategic circumstances between their conception and the commissioning of the first ships. The prospective enemy for Britain had shifted from a Franco-Russian alliance with many armoured cruisers to a resurgent and increasingly belligerent Germany. Diplomatically, Britain had entered the Entente Cordiale in 1904 and the Anglo-Russian Entente. Neither France nor Russia posed a particular naval threat. The Russian Navy had largely been sunk or captured in the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 to 1905, while the French were in no hurry to adopt the new dreadnought-type design. Britain also boasted very cordial relations with 2 of the significant new naval powers, Japan, bolstered by the Anglo-Japanese alliance, signed in 1902 and renewed in 1905, and the US. These changed strategic circumstances, and the great success of the dreadnought, ensured that she rather than the Invincible became the new model capital ship. Nevertheless, battlecruiser construction played a part in the renewed naval arms race sparked by the dreadnought. For their first few years of service, the Invincibles entirely fulfilled Fisher's vision of being able to sink any ship fast enough to catch them, and run from any ship capable of sinking them. An Invincible would also, in many circumstances, be able to take on an enemy pre-dreadnought battleship. Naval circles concurred that the armored cruiser in its current form had come to the logical end of its development, and the Invincibles were so far ahead of any enemy armored cruiser in firepower and speed that it proved difficult to justify building more or bigger cruisers. This lead was extended by the surprise both dreadnought and Invincible produced by having been built in secret. This prompted most other navies to delay their building programs and radically revise their designs. This was particularly true for cruisers, because the details of the Invincible class were kept secret for longer. This meant that the last German armored cruiser, Blücher, was armed with only 21 cm, 8.3 in, guns, and was no match for the new battle cruisers. The Royal Navy's early superiority in capital ships led to the rejection of a 1905 to 1906 design that would, essentially, have fused the battlecruiser and battleship concepts into what would eventually become the fast battleship. The X4 design combined the full armor and armament of Dreadnought with the 25-knot speed of Invincible. The additional cost could not be justified given the existing British lead and the new Liberal government's need for economy. The slower and cheaper Bellerophon, a relatively close copy of Dreadnought, was adopted instead. The X4 concept would eventually be fulfilled in the Queen Elizabeth class and later by other navies. The next British battlecruisers were the three Indefatigable class, slightly improved Invincibles built to fundamentally the same specification, partly due to political pressure to limit costs and partly due to the secrecy surrounding German battlecruiser construction, particularly about the heavy armor of SMS von der Ten. This class came to be widely seen as a mistake, and the next generation of British battlecruisers were markedly more powerful. By 1909 to 1910 a sense of national crisis about rivalry with Germany outweighed cost-cutting, and a naval panic resulted in the approval of a total of 8 capital ships in 1909 to 1910. Fisher pressed for all 8 to be battlecruisers, but was unable to have his way. He had to settle for 6 battleships and 2 battlecruisers of the Lion class. The Lions carried 8 13.5-inch guns, the now standard caliber of the British Super Dreadnought battleships. Speed increased to 27 knots, 50 km per hour, 31 miles per hour, and armor protection, while not as good as in German designs, was better than in previous British battlecruisers, with 9-inch, 230 mm, armor belt and barbettes. The 2 Lions were followed by the very similar Queen Mary. By 1911 Germany had built battlecruisers of her own, and the superiority of the British ships could no longer be assured. Moreover, the German Navy did not share Fisher's view of the battlecruiser. In contrast to the British focus on increasing speed and firepower, Germany progressively improved the armor and staying power of their ships to better the British battlecruisers. Von der Ten, begun in 1908 and completed in 1910, carried 8 11.1-inch guns, but with 11.1-inch, 283 mm, armor she was far better protected than the Invincibles. The 2 Maltkas were quite similar but carried 10 11.1-inch guns of an improved design. Seydlitz, designed in 1909 and finished in 1913, was a modified Maltka. Speed increased by 1 knot to 26.5 knots, 49.1 km per hour, 30.5 miles per hour, while her armor had a maximum thickness of 12 inches, equivalent to the Helgoland-class battleships of a few years earlier. Seydlitz was Germany's last battlecruiser completed before World War I. The next step in battlecruiser design came from Japan. The Imperial Japanese Navy had been planning the Kongo-class ships from 1909, and was determined that, since the Japanese economy could support relatively few ships, each would be more powerful than its likely competitors. Initially the class was planned with the Invincibles as the benchmark. On learning of the British plans for Lion, and the likelihood that new U.S. Navy battleships would be armed with 14-inch, 360 mm, guns, the Japanese decided to radically revise their plans and go one better. A new plan was drawn up, carrying 8 14-inch guns, and capable of 27.5 knots, 50.9 km per hour, 31.6 miles per hour, thus marginally having the edge over the Lions in speed and firepower. The heavy guns were also better positioned, being super-firing both fore and aft with no turret amidships. The armor scheme was also marginally improved over the Lions, with 9 inches of armor on the turrets and 8 inches, 203 mm, on the barbettes. The first ship in the class was built in Britain, and a further 3 constructed in Japan. The Japanese also reclassified their powerful armored cruisers of the Tsukuba and Ibuki classes, carrying 4 12-inch guns, as battlecruisers. Nonetheless, their armament was weaker and they were slower than any battlecruiser. The next British battlecruiser, Tiger, was intended initially as the 4th ship in the Lion class, but was substantially redesigned. She retained the 8 13.5-inch guns of her predecessors, but they were positioned like those of Congo for better fields of fire. She was faster, making 29 knots, 54 km per hour, 33 miles per hour, on sea trials, and carried a heavier secondary armament. Tiger was also more heavily armored on the whole, while the maximum thickness of armor was the same at 9 inches, the height of the main armor belt was increased. Not all the desired improvements for this ship were approved, however. Her designer, Sir Eustace Tennyson d'Eyncourt, had wanted small-bore water tube boilers and geared turbines to give her a speed of 32 knots, 59 kilometers per hour, 37 miles per hour, but he received no support from the authorities and the engine makers refused his request. 1912 saw work begin on 3 more German battlecruisers of the Derfflinger class, the first German battlecruisers to mount 12-inch guns. These ships, like Tiger and the Congos, had their guns arranged in super-firing turrets for greater efficiency. Their armor and speed was similar to the previous Seydlitz class. In 1913, the Russian Empire also began the construction of the 4-ship Borodino class, which were designed for service in the Baltic Sea. These ships were designed to carry 12 14-inch guns, with armor up to 12 inches thick, and a speed of 26.6 knots, 49.3 kilometers per hour, 30.6 miles per hour. The heavy armor and relatively slow speed of these ships made them more similar to German designs than to British ships. Construction of the Borodinos was halted by the First World War and all were scrapped after the end of the Russian Civil War. World War I. Construction. For most of the combatants, capital ship construction was very limited during the war. Germany finished the Derfflinger class and began work on the Mackensen class. The Mackensens were a development of the Derfflinger class, with 13.8-inch guns and a broadly similar armor scheme, designed for 28 knots, 52 kilometers per hour, 32 miles per hour. In Britain, Jackie Fisher returned to the office of First Sea Lord in October 1914. His enthusiasm for big, fast ships was unabated, and he set designers to producing a design for a battlecruiser with 15-inch guns. Because Fisher expected the next German battlecruiser to steam at 28 knots, he required the new British design to be capable of 32 knots. He planned to reorder 2 Revenge-class battleships, which had been approved but not yet laid down, to a new design. Fisher finally received approval for this project on December 28, 1914, and they became the Renown class. With 6 15-inch guns but only 6-inch armor, they were a further step forward from Tiger in firepower and speed, but returned to the level of protection of the first British battle cruisers. At the same time, Fisher resorted to subterfuge to obtain another 3 fast, lightly armored ships that could use several spare 15-inch, 381 mm, gun turrets left over from battleship construction. These ships were essentially light battle cruisers, and Fisher occasionally referred to them as such, but officially they were classified as large light cruisers. This unusual designation was required because construction of new capital ships had been placed on hold, while there were no limits on light cruiser construction. They became Courageous and her sisters Glorious and Furious, and there was a bizarre imbalance between their main guns of 15 inches, or 18 inches, 457 mm, in Furious, and their armor, which at 3 inches, 76 mm, thickness was on the scale of a light cruiser. The design was generally regarded as a failure, nicknamed in the fleet outrageous, uproarious, and spurious, though the later conversion of the ships to aircraft carriers was very successful. Fisher also speculated about a new mammoth, but lightly built battle cruiser, that would carry 20-inch, 508 mm, guns, which he termed HMS Incomparable. This never got beyond the concept stage. It is often held that the Renown and Courageous classes were designed for Fisher's plan to land troops, possibly Russian, on the German Baltic coast. Specifically, they were designed with a reduced draft, which might be important in the shallow Baltic. This is not clear-cut evidence that the ships were designed for the Baltic. It was considered that earlier ships had too much draft and not enough freeboard under operational conditions. Roberts argues that the focus on the Baltic was probably unimportant at the time the ships were designed, but was inflated later, after the disastrous Dardanelles campaign. The final British battlecruiser design of the war was the Admiral class, which was born from a requirement for an improved version of the Queen Elizabeth battleship. The project began at the end of 1915, after Fisher's final departure from the Admiralty. While initially envisaged as a battleship, senior sea officers felt that Britain had enough battleships, but that new battlecruisers might be required to combat German ships being built. The British overestimated German progress on the Mackensen class as well as their likely capabilities. A battlecruiser design with 8 15-inch guns, 8 inches of armor and capable of 32 knots was decided on. The experience of battlecruisers at the Battle of Jutland meant that the design was radically revised and transformed again into a fast battleship with armor up to 12 inches thick, but still capable of 31.5 knots, 58.3 kilometers per hour, 36.2 miles per hour. The first ship in the class, Hood, was built according to this design to counter the possible completion of any of the Mackensen-class ship. The plans for her three sisters, on which little work had been done, were revised once more later in 1916 and in 1917 to improve protection. The Admiral class would have been the only British ships capable of taking on the German Mackensen class. Nevertheless, German shipbuilding was drastically slowed by the war, and while 2 Mackensens were launched, none were ever completed. The Germans also worked briefly on a further 3 ships, of the Ersatz-York class, which were modified versions of the Mackensens with 15-inch guns. Work on the 3 additional admirals was suspended in March 1917 to enable more escorts and merchant ships to be built to deal with the new threat from U-boats to trade. They were finally cancelled in February 1919. Battlecruisers in action. The first combat involving battlecruisers during World War I was the Battle of Heligoland Bight in August 1914. A force of British light cruisers and destroyers entered the Heligoland Bight, the part of the North Sea closest to Hamburg, to attack German destroyer patrols. When they met opposition from light cruisers, Vice Admiral David Beatty took his squadron of 5 battlecruisers into the Bight and turned the tide of the battle, ultimately sinking 3 German light cruisers and killing their commander, Rear Admiral Lieberecht Moss. The German battlecruiser Goeben perhaps made the most impact early in the war. Stationed in the Mediterranean, she and the escorting light cruiser SMS Breslau evaded British and French ships on the outbreak of war, and steamed to Constantinople, Istanbul, with 2 British battlecruisers in hot pursuit. The 2 German ships were handed over to the Ottoman Navy, and this was instrumental in bringing the Ottoman Empire into the war as one of the central powers. Goeben herself, renamed Yavuz Sultan Selim, fought engagements against the Imperial Russian Navy in the Black Sea before being knocked out of the action for the remainder of the war after the Battle of Imbros against British forces in the Aegean Sea in January 1918. The original battlecruiser concept proved successful in December 1914 at the Battle of the Falkland Islands. The British battlecruisers Inflexible and Invincible did precisely the job for which they were.
Please subscribe and thanks for watching.